extraordinary event.
Hello and welcome to Stateline. I'm Judy Tierney. This morning, Martin Bryant was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. A life sentence for each of the 35 murders at Port Arthur and another 21 years for his other crimes. In sentencing Bryant, the Chief Justice said the community would feel outrage, anger, grief and frustration at not being able to do more to redress the wrong suffered by so many victims. Mr. Justice Cox also acknowledged many people would be severely affected by their experiences for years to come. Shortly, we'll bring you an extended interview with a psychiatrist who helped negotiate with Martin Bryant during the Seascape Cottage siege and who subsequently interviewed him in Risdon Prison. But first, today's response to the sentencing from outside the Supreme Court.
It doesn't change our lives. We're obviously pleased with the sentence, I think, but it doesn't change our lives.
Is life in jail enough for you?
No. I think all Australians should now look at a debate on the reintroduction of capital punishment for mass murder. And if they look at it, they can look at it, making it retrospective to the 28th of April 1996, because our lives have been destroyed. And that man has had 7 months more life than my daughter and the other 34 victims have had.
Well, I do feel now it is all over as far as he is concerned. It's not over for us. We're going to have a lifetime of tragedy. With the sentence handed down, it was a mass murder. I feel there's only one answer for that, and that, I might sound girlish, but it is capital punishment. 35 innocent people have been taken, and he's going to remain for life in jail. He can look at the outside world. We can, but we haven't got a partner to do it with.
How have you found the strength to go on?
Well, I promised my wife, Gwen, that I would see this through. I don't know what's going to happen as of today, or as of tomorrow when I leave Port Arthur. The only thing is, of course, the memories are there, and I would hope that they would see us through.
It's pretty bad for anybody, particularly those that lost people. I survived, and I thank God I survived, but I feel terrible for all the people, naturally.
Is jail enough for Martin Bryant?
I'm of the opinion that death sentence is the appropriate here. He even wished that he was dead, so I think in my personal view, yes. I hated the man right up until the sentencing, and when I learned of his past, I suppose as a mother, I had a certain sense of pity for his past, but not for what he did. I don't condone what he did at all.
Just looking at him, he's a rather pathetic person, and you know, I'm just glad it's all over.
Oh, I think the appropriate penalty's been handed down, and it doesn't take me by surprise, nor my client.
Have you seen Martin Bryant?
I've just been speaking to him. Well, in his usual way, he said something probably quite inappropriate. He said he was happy with the sentence, but I think he meant it was appropriate.
Do you think he's finally showing some remorse?
Look, I think this question of remorse is rather difficult because the doctors tell me that he can't empathise with people, and I'm not sure a person in that situation is capable of remorse.
How's it been on you personally representing Bryant?
Oh, it's been a pressure that I'm glad to now have behind me.
Does he appreciate that he's going to be losing his assets?
He appreciates that he's going to lose his assets in due course, yes.
Is he aware of the wider effect of his actions, particularly in the changes to gun laws?
Oh, I think in his simple way he understands that, but I don't think that's been something that's been telling on his mind.
Are you writing a book about your experience with this case?
Oh, I haven't written anything yet apart from my thoughts each day that I've been involved in this.
What was the first thing he said to you after the sentence, John?
Oh, he said he'd like to have another can of Pepsi.
Really?
And did he? Could he?
Yeah, and I shared it with him.
The judge said he should be pitied. Do you pity him?
Oh, I don't think it's appropriate for me at this stage to say whether I pity him. He's a client, and I'll be continuing to see him for other purposes.
Do you have any concern about any element of the sentencing remarks that Mr. Justice Cox made today?
No, none at all. I think they were entirely appropriate and as expected.
And now to psychiatrist Ian Sale, who's conducted interview sessions with Martin Bryant in Hobart's Risdon prison. I recorded this extensive interview with him earlier this week, and in it, Dr. Sale offers some compelling insights into the mind of the Port Arthur gunman. Ian Sale, at the beginning of the siege, what were you thinking Martin Bryant might be doing?
Well, initially we didn't know it was Martin Bryant. The name emerged as the night wore on when, I think it came from when a passport was discovered in the abandoned vehicle. Initially all we had was a man who called himself Jamie speaking on the phone. And gradually as the night wore on, more and more pieces of information came through, including the identity Martin Bryant.
You went to Martin Bryant's house late on that day. What did you see there that could give you some idea of what you were dealing with?
Right. Well, going to a person's house often is very revealing of a person's personality. And it was also, there was some hope maybe of finding something that would indicate his intentions, his motivation. So I went out to his house. I think it was probably around about 10 o'clock when I went to the house with police. The house was, even allowing for the circumstances, there was an absolute oddness about the house. I remember you had to make your way through a very overgrown garden path, and it was intensely dark, almost a sort of gothic feeling to the place. But then when you entered the house, there were conflicting impressions. On the one hand, it was cluttered, but it wasn't actually squalid.
Well, what were some of the items you saw there that you might have considered slightly odd?
Right. Well, the first thing you meet as you go through the door was there was a Christmas tree. It was still with decorations, and of course this was April. There were lots of toys and knickknacks, sometimes still in their packets. Particularly striking one was a large Bart Simpson in the kitchen. There was also a noddy sat on a cuckoo clock in the kitchen. There were very large numbers of videos throughout the house, and I believe the total count sometime later was of the order of about 1,300, which I've never seen in one single house before.
And what did they range from in terms of the content of those videos?
They were the full range. There was no obvious genre that the occupant of that house liked, and obviously we're looking at that to see if there was any video that might give some idea as to what the script for this event was. But this was everything from the normal action-type movies with Arnold Schwarzenegger and so on, through to The Sound of Music, of which there were 3 copies. So there was no theme to the videos there at all.
And what other objects took your interest?
One of the more puzzling things was in the lounge room where the video player was, there was a large bird cage, although initially uncertain as to whether it was in fact a bird cage. It was a large wooden contraption, and obviously the bird that had resided in that cage was going to be a large one. There was no sign of a recent inhabitant in that cage, though, but it did certainly strike as odd. One of the odd things about the house was that some rooms were very cluttered and others were very sparsely furnished, and again this added to the feeling of oddness. For example, there was a room where there were some magazines on firearms and ammunition, but there were only about 2 chairs in that entire room, and it was quite a contrast, say, to some of the bedrooms where you could barely move about. There was so much in them.
Was there any evidence of ammunition or guns there?
There were wrappers to firearms and ammunition found in a sort of scullery room.
And what did you make of seeing the gun magazines in a room and just 2 chairs?
Well, again, there was this feeling of oddness about the place. The gun magazines only went back a short period too. There was no sign that this had been a long-standing interest. In fact, there was no sign of anything having been a long-standing interest, other than perhaps the videos.
And your first contact with Martin Bryant, what was that?
Well, the first contact was the indirect contact through being with the police negotiators during the siege, and there were some conversations between police officers and Bryant in the house. Later, when the siege ended and he was in the Royal Hobart Hospital, there was some I had some initial contact during that first day when there were some difficulties in determining when Bryant was fit to be interviewed by police.
Some of the conversations you had with him, what can you recall?
Well, there were some unusual conversations while he was at Seascape, which I listened into. The striking thing down there was that when you're present at most siege events, the individuals are extremely aroused, extremely angry, and they curse and they swear, and they're often intoxicated as well. With Bryant, it was quite different. He was polite, almost meticulously civil at times, no sign of arousal in his voice at all. And at times it reached almost a silliness. For example, there was an occasion when inadvertently an ABC journalist had phoned Seascape, apparently looking for accommodation. And that obviously irritated him, because the next time he was on the phone to the negotiator, he chided us, chastised us, and it was almost as if we were being told off by our primary school teacher.
Saying what?
That you must not let that happen again in future. Keep them away from me.
What else is there from the transcript that's evidence of his politeness?
Well, there was another occasion when he terminated a phone call, said that he would have to go because there was a kettle going downstairs and it was necessary for him to go make cups of tea and sandwiches for the hostages.
Hostages?
For the hostages.
And yet that was early evening, and...
That would have been early evening, probably around 6, 7 o'clock.
And he probably only had one hostage at that time?
If he had one, yes. I think there's a lot of speculation as to whether he would have had any at that stage. But that's what he said. It was said in this polite manner, and he terminated the phone call. He kept control. He said, I'll ring you back at 5:45. And that's what he did.
So he was aware of the time at that stage, obviously?
Oh, yes, yes.
No confusion over the day's events?
No, no.
Do you think at that stage he might have even forgotten what he'd done through the day?
I wouldn't have a clue. He was certainly at that stage already giving us the line about that he wasn't at Port Arthur, that must have been somebody else, that he'd been down at Roaring Beach, and that all he had done had been to take this BMW.
And what took place at that first contact at the hospital?
Well, at the hospital he'd been sedated because of his burns, and I suspect also because of some anxiety on hospital staff's part as to the situation they faced. And so the problem arose as to when he was alert enough to be interviewed, and so the police asked me to assist in determining this in liaison with hospital staff. That was eventually possible late on the Monday afternoon. But even then, there was a feeling that Bryant was probably feigning a degree of stupor.
What made you think that?
Well, it was pointed out that even though he was snuggling up under the pillows as if responding to the sedatives again, the various monitors on him indicated that he was becoming physiologically aroused, so he was aware of what was going on and responding to it, but in fact looking as if he was falling back into a stupor, so that really didn't add up, and so we thought it was feigning.
Your next contact with him?
Would have been some weeks later when I interviewed him at the prison. I interviewed him on 2 occasions at the prison hospital, at the request of the Director of Public Prosecutions.
And when you first visited him there, what did you find?
Well, first of all, you found a lot of security. He was being well guarded down one end of the prison hospital, and his room was being monitored by video for all the time, and when you saw him, he was in shackles, or certainly was for the first interview. I had expected a sense of menace, of perhaps revulsion, because of what he'd done, and I knew very well what he'd done. I'd seen a lot of the evidence of that. But that didn't come across. In fact, he came across as bland and fatuous and silly. And you kept on having to remind oneself of what he'd done, because otherwise there was an unreality about the interview.
What was he saying to you that gave you that impression?
It's not so much as to what he was saying, but it was how he was saying, and this was in the same way as he'd conducted earlier conversations during the siege and when he'd been formally interviewed by police.
Like what?
Very bland, very little tonal variation in his voice. His voice has an unusual quality. It's high-pitched for a 29-year-old male, almost effeminate in some ways. And there is no expression of emotion in this voice. Although the voice is civil and correct, there is no sense of feeling comes through.
What did you ask him, and what responses did you get to those questions?
I asked him about his general background, and generally he was comfortable about telling me about his family and the schools he went to, and his friendship with Ms. Harvey and some of his girlfriends. I obviously also asked him about Port Arthur, but he continued to maintain that at that stage, that he hadn't been involved in that he wasn't there, that he'd been on Tasman Peninsula, that he'd been surfing at Roaring Beach, and that he had not visited the historic site at all that day. And that's been the same story that he'd presented, to negotiators during the conversations while he was at Seascape, and again to police when he was formally interviewed. So he had maintained that particular line.
How far were you able to get with him during the interviews?
He maintained that denial during both interviews, despite, on the second occasion, I presented him with evidence that he had been there. I played a tape of his voice recorded at Seascape, and while he seemed unsettled by that, there was still no deviation from that line that he'd been at Roaring Beach, he'd been surfing, and that all he had done was that he had hijacked a BMW on the Fortescue Bay Road, and this was precisely the same story that he had maintained right from day one. He was somewhat cagey, somewhat defensive. He knew I was there not on his behalf, but on the behalf of the prosecutor, and that was very, very clear that he was bearing that in mind.
He was playing a game with you?
There was a certain, yes, there was a certain amount of game playing, and also not just with me, but with the prison officers who were present at the back of the room during the interview, that he would make quips and inane remarks to them.
Was there any sign of laughter?
Yes, well, not so much laughter, more of snickering than laughter. There was a fatuous snickering, smirking. Sometimes his body gestures were odd as well. He would tend to have rather sinuous movements of his hands, quite different from the ordinary gestures one makes during a conversation.
How do you mean? Can you show me what
Yes, sometimes while he would be talking, his hands would be almost moving like this. And at a later stage, when I observed him by video while he was in his room, it was pointed out to me by prison staff that he was making similar movements when alone in his room, and sometimes he would dance I suppose one would call it dance in a sinuous way. It was very difficult to describe. Initially I thought, he's doing some aerobics, it's some sort of fitness routine, but it wasn't. It was something quite odd.
What did you make of all of this?
Well, piecing together all the information that gradually became available about him, and I suppose it's still incomplete in that I don't know what his true recall of events down at Port Arthur is. But I think he is a person who, even without Port Arthur, would have been judged as an abnormal person, that there is something definitely unusual, different about this individual. It is known right from childhood that there were major problems in his development.
What were some of those problems?
His language development was delayed, and it was necessary for him to receive speech therapy as a young child. The biggest problem, though, as a child and continued through into his adulthood, was his ability to relate to others socially. He always had major difficulties here and caused problems at any school he was at. He just could not relate with other children, nor could they relate with him. And it seems to me that he, although he has an acquired reasonable speech, his communication of emotions and the other things that go towards forming an interaction with another person, doesn't occur in the ordinary way. His body gestures are wrong. His expression of emotion is wrong. In fact, I doubt that he is able to perceive or at least express emotions such as sadness, emotions such as remorse, emotions such as envy.
So there's an equilibrium line there that doesn't ever alter.
It doesn't change, and what people saw in court recently, which obviously caused great distress,
when he laughed.
When he laughed and he snickered and he smirked and he raised eyebrows and he generally behaved in an inappropriate and distressing way. That's been his behaviour all the way along. It changes very little.
He'd had a number of relationships prior to that day at Port Arthur. How normal were they?
I think he discovered sexuality probably fairly late. He'd had a number of relationships over a period of about 3 or 4 years prior to Port Arthur, a number of girlfriends. And as far as I'm aware, he was able to maintain a sexual relationship with them. Some of them have said, not just to me but to others, that at times his sexual interests they were odd and disconcerting, but he seemed to have a normal sexual drive at that time, so he got there, but rather late.
And what about his changes in appearance, how he tried to change his persona?
Which probably reflects the lack of continuity in his personality, or the lack of identity in his personality, and also the same with the house, that there was no sense of identity in that house.
So he didn't know who he was or what he was?
Absolutely.
So you've really not been able to identify why Martin Bryant did this?
That's right, I can't identify the motivation. There is speculation, obviously. There's a belief that his relationship with the Martins was probably central to his behaviour that day.
In what way?
Well, that they were the only people involved that he knew. He'd had previous contact with them. And there was some belief that maybe he bore some grudge against the Martins. It had been told to me that he was able to bear grudges, and sometimes for very long periods of time.
And yet that goes against what you said earlier, that he wasn't able to have great feelings towards anything.
Well, they don't express their feelings, so maybe they have their feelings and they act on their feelings, but you wouldn't know because they don't show it in an ordinary human way. Their facial expressions are often bland and fatuous, or certainly in this man, and their body language conveys nothing in particular.
So there'll be no way of ever really understanding why he did it?
Well, maybe he'll choose to talk about why he did it now that he has changed his plea. And I hope we do know about this. I think it's important to try and understand these reasons. But until then, it remains speculation. And as I say, the relationship with the Martins, that might be important. The occurrence of Dunblane, not that long beforehand, that might also be important in some way. But otherwise, I think it remains a total mystery.
Many people are saying that Martin Bryant is bad, not mad. How would you describe him?
I think he's basically wired up badly, rather than being either of those alternatives. I think he's always been that way, something of a child in a man's body, an individual who, until fairly recently, there were certain restraints on. For example, his father. But his father died, and his companion died in a car accident, and following that, any economic restraints were also removed in that he acquired a sum of money and he was able to purchase whatever he wished. And in the last few months, those purchases turned to firearms.
How does Martin Bryant feel about the fact he's going to be incarcerated for the rest of his life?
I would imagine that he would probably have to be kept in isolation almost indefinitely. I believe if he was placed amongst the ordinary prisoner population, he would be at obvious hazard.
Is there a likelihood that his condition could deteriorate?
No, it's a static situation. It's a problem that individuals are born with, some inherent defect in the way that they communicate emotionally and deal with language, and it stays that way.
Is he conscious of the fact that life isn't going to be very pleasant for the rest of his life?
Well, that's certainly been put to him, but whether it has any emotional impact upon him is anyone's guess. He certainly doesn't appear distressed in any way.
How should people who have been affected by this think of Martin Bryant?
Well, I know that his behaviour in court caused incredible distress. I was there and I witnessed that behaviour. It's known that people who suffer post-traumatic symptoms will develop more severe symptoms if the trauma involved is by human design. That is, you're more likely to have problems than, say, if there's a flood or a bushfire or whatever. I would try and encourage people, well, I would encourage people to try and conceive of Martin Bryant as more as a natural disaster than as a man-made, a human-designed disaster. He is an extraordinary event. If he holds malice against the people he killed or wounded, well, I don't know if he does or not. I don't know what goes on inside there. I don't think there are any emotions that we can relate to. So perhaps if people see him as some freak of nature, some natural disaster, rather than a malicious human being, perhaps it may be easier for them to recover from what's occurred.
And that's all tonight on Stateline. We'll be back again next Friday at 6. And a reminder, this programme will be repeated at 12 o'clock tomorrow. Good night.